Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to have you all with us for this conversation. My name is Daniel Herrera Kelly, and I'm the Associate Analysis Manager for ACLED, or Armed Conflict Location and Events Data. We are the leading source of data and analysis on global conflict, and the report that brings us together today is actually a prime example of that analysis. Today I'll be moderating a session where we'll be discussing a report very recently released called How the Sinaloa Cartel Rift is Redrawing Mexico's Criminal Map. This report examines the fallout of the Sinaloa Cartel following the arrest of Ismael El Mayo Zambada in the US in July 2024, which has marked a breaking point for the cartel. Now, the outbreak of clashes and attacks following El Mayo's arrest contributed to 2024 recording some of the highest levels of violence involving non-state armed groups in Mexico over the last 6 years. It has contributed to persistently high levels of violence across the country since, and it has impacted relations and sort of prompted a realignment between the various criminal groups present in Mexico. To understand the significance of the rift within the Sinaloa cartel and its impact on wider cartel violence, the analysis in this report focuses initially also on how the group came to garner the influence it had and how its internal structure enabled the expansion across the country. And to walk us through this analysis, who better than the two authors of the report who are joining us today, Maria Fernanda Rocha and Sandra Pellegrini. Maria Fernanda is the Central America Research Manager at ACLED, where she manages the data collection team, supports the review of data quality, and contributes to data analysis such as this report. Her expertise includes organized crime dynamics, security policies, and in particular, a focus on their impacts on development conditions in Latin America. In turn, Sandra Pellegrini is ACLED's Latin America and the Caribbean Senior Analyst. And in that role, she conducts and coordinates analysis and oversees the accuracy of conflict trends in the regions, focusing specifically on political violence in Latin America, non-state actors, and organized crime dynamics. Thank you both for being here, Maria Fernanda and Sandra, and congratulations on what is an excellent and very timely report. We also have the immense privilege and are very grateful to have the presence of Armando Vargas. Armando is the director of the security program at Mexico Evalua. He specializes in the socio-political dimensions of security, violence, and organized crime, as well as comparative methods. And in addition to this role at Mexico Evalua, Armando is also a part-time professor at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at the UNAM and a member of the National System of Researchers at CONACYT. He's a political analyst and also writes a bi-weekly column for Expansión Política. We are very, very grateful to have you here. Just as a reminder, there will be ample time for questions and answers from everyone who's here connecting with us. That will happen after all three panelists speak, but do feel free to pop your questions for them in the Q&A function that you have in your screens throughout the event. And you can do so either in English and in Spanish, and we'll do our very best to answer as many of your questions as we can. Now, with that, and without further ado, I will pass it over to Maria Fernanda to start us off. Maria Fernanda, if you may.
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. So we can start with a few background points that will help us discuss how the conflict between the cartel's faction has evolved. So next slide, please. Well, since the Sinaloa Cartel began its operations in the 90s, it has worked as a federation that gathers multiple criminal organizations. The main characteristic of its structure is that it doesn't have a rigid hierarchy as do other criminal organizations. While various alliances among criminal leaders were essential to the cartel's formation, the primary factions are the ones that continue to be aligned with the cartel's main founders, the two main founders. We have first the faction of Los Chapitos, that is one led by the sons of one of the founders, the Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, And the second faction is the faction of Los Mayos or La Malliza, which was one led by Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and after his arrest last year, it has been headed by one of his sons, El Mayito Flaco. The cartel has traditionally dominated criminal activities and trafficking routes in the northwestern part of the country, in states that are part of the Golden Triangle area. We have Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango, and also states in the northwestern border with the US. Although there has been previous disruption in the leadership of the cartel, like after the arrest and extradition of El Chapo, and also tensions and fractures within the federation, the cartel had historically managed to maintain relative unity. However, what we are seeing now is that after the alleged treason by Los Chapitos that led to the arrest of El Mayo on 25 July, is an open conflict between these two main factions that, as it was said before, it has contributed to the highest levels of violence involving non-state armed group that the country has experienced in the last 6 years, and still continue to drive high levels of violence. So let's understand better how the conflict has unfolded, particularly in the areas controlled by the cartel. So please, next slide. So in what is considered the cartel stronghold, as we saw in the previous map, we see the main impact of the war. So first, we have the state of Sinaloa that has been the epicenter of the war, and where the attacks and clashes have increased since September 2024. This also led to a change in the patterns of violence that were seen before in this state. And to understand the main dynamics that have changed, we have first the most evident one is the outbreak of violence following the arrest of Zambada, which contradicts the cartel's traditional approach of minimizing the risk of direct conflict between factions through negotiations or other non-violent actions that to a certain extent helped to maintain low levels of violence in the areas they control. So we see, as we see in the graph here, Sinaloa is a good example of this pattern, and how the levels of violence were relatively low. And after the arrest, we see a sudden spike. So between July and March, the 8 months after the arrest of El Mayo, we see how attacks of gangs targeting civilians and gun-on-gun clashes have nearly quadrupled compared to the previous 8 months. But in general, in overall, we see that levels of violence have reached levels that we have never seen in this state before, at least since ACLED began covering Mexico in 2018. Next slide, please. The other dynamic that has changed after the outbreak of the war is the geographical distribution of violence. So we see how the violent actions of the faction have sought to redraw the controlled areas. We can see here in the maps the comparison between the two different periods, 8 months before the arrest and after the arrest, and how in Sinaloa violence has primarily concentrated in the capital, Culiacan, which has been, even before the arrest of Zambada, the battleground for disputes. And while still continues to be an area disputed, we see how violence has spread to rural areas within the Culiacan municipality, but also to other municipalities in the south along the Pacific coast, and villages that are crossed by the federal highway that connects Culiacan to the second city of the state, Mazatlan. That's also crucial for commercial and touristic activities, and has a port that is also controlled by the cartel. Then the third dynamic that is relevant to flag, and it's a change that we see in after also the outbreak of the war, is the alarming levels of violence targeting civilians that we are recording. This also goes against what was before the Sinaloa cartel's reputation for using less overt violence against civilians compared to other criminal groups. Not only civilians are being caught in crossfire, we see also how the factions of the cartel are carrying out targeted attacks against prominent figures like social media influencers, how these attacks are used to advertise the strength of the different factions or to intimidate the rivals' followers. Also, another group that is being targeted by the factions are politicians and political authorities, particularly at the local level. And these are also attacks that somehow are used to diminish the rivals' political influence or to establish control. Apart from that, we have that as violent or the most evident violence, but there are other forms of violence that are less visible that are also increasing in the state, such as kidnappings and forced disappearance. That is also raising concerns. Please, next slide. Outside Sinaloa, we also see how the fight between the faction has led to increases in violence in other states where the cartel has had traditional presence. So, such is the case of Sonora and Baja California. In there, one of the examples that could help us show how the war between factions and allies has intensified after the arrest of Zambada. So we have the case of San Luis Rio Colorado, the municipality in Sonora, and the municipality of Mexicali in Baja California. In these two municipalities that are neighbors, we see how Los Rusos, that is an ally of Los Mayos, Los Chapitos, and Los Salazar, former partners of Los Chapitos. These three groups are disputing for the control of strategic areas of the border with the US that are important for drug, human, and weapon trafficking. And that violence intensifies after the arrest of El Mayo, and you can see that also in the graph here. And then there are also cases in which we see a small increase in other areas that have recorded relatively low levels of violence, like the state of Durango. In the 8 months after the arrest of Zambada, violence have doubled compared to the previous 8 months. And while the increase is less evident than the cases compared to the cases that we have discussed before, it still raises concern for potential spikes in violence in this state. So this is an overview in general of how trends have changed after following the arrest of El Mayo and the outbreak of the war. But the fight has also impacted other areas and has also involved other criminal groups. But I will hand it over to Sandra, who will discuss these and other topics with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. So as we just saw, as part of the report, we have looked first at how the Sinaloa Cartel factional war might have been spilling to other territory where it had a significant influence. And another aspect in conflict dynamics that we're interested in as part of the report has been whether the Sinaloa Cartel dispute also began to have an impact on the conflict dynamics involving rival groups. So one of the questions that emerged early on after the outbreak of the Sinaloa conflict was how rival criminal groups, especially its main rival, the Jalisco New Generation cartels, were going to react to a rift and a potentially weakened Sinaloa cartel. So far, what we have seen from our data is that we have not identified sweeping and significant move from other criminal groups such as the Jalisco New Generation cartels Obviously, bearing in mind that the conflict scenario in Mexico currently is one that is evolving and still highly volatile. So as such, we're probably still only seeing or not yet seeing the full breadth of the changes. But what we have identified in the data sets in the months that followed the outbreak of the Sinaloa factional war is that conflict have intensified in very punctual and highly strategic area, which here suggests that instead of launching a large-scale incursions, rival criminal groups probably concentrated are concentrating their warring power in asserting dominance in vital and key strategic points for illicit activities. A few examples of that are, for instance, the case of Tijuana in the state of Baja California, which is a border city with the US and has been a key area for trafficking activities and disputed by several groups, including the Sinaloa, the Jalisco New Generations, and the Tijuana Cartel. And there we have recorded a 16% increase in violence targeting civilians and gang-on-gang clashes between July and March 2025 compared to the previous 8 months. We're also observing similar dynamics of rising violence in Manzanillo in the state of Colima, which has been where the Jalisco New Generation Cartel usually has an upper end, but the port of Manzanillo more specifically has been disputed with Sinaloa. And there as well, we have seen that intentions to raise control over the port and sea trafficking routes have led to a rise in violence. And likewise, in Huajicori, in the state of Nayarit, where ACLED has in the past year recorded lower levels of violence compared to other hotspots of violence, we have also seen a surge of violence, where here could suggest, the intentions of and be the consequences of the war between the Jalisco New Generation cartels and the Sinaloa to control this corridor that helps connect the Sinaloa cartel with Zacatecas, which has been a particularly strategic state to connect the Pacific coast with northern trafficking corridor, not to mention that it's also close by Durango. So these are a few examples, but what's also interesting from the data set is that the response from rival criminal groups has not been uniform across the country. So we have seen increase of violence in very specific and localized area rather than a widespread escalation. But in contrast, in regions that have experienced intense criminal disputes, so I'm thinking of Chiapas, for instance, where the Jalisco New Generation cartels and the Sinaloa cartel has been locked in open conflict in recent years, with violence especially rising in 2020, in the first 3 quarters of 2024. And there we have seen a notable decrease in violence, about a 51% drop in gang-on-gang clashes and violence targeting civilians in Chiapas since El Mayo's arrest compared to the previous 8 months. So this runs counter to the expectations that the Jalisco New Generation cartels would, for instance, push for a massive territorial expansion. There's obviously several possible factors that can explain that decrease. One is that state-led forces and increased coordination with federal forces could have played a role. Another factor is also the heightened scrutiny and pressure that has been placed on those two main criminal groups following the designations their designations of foreign terrorist organizations by the US, which may have also triggered both a stronger state response, but also a more cautious behavior from criminal actors who might be perhaps opting to maintain a lower profile or redirect resources to more strategic fronts. But in any case, I think it's important not to interpret reductions in violence as the evidence of a defeat or withdrawals of criminal groups. And I think on the contrary, it can underscore some of the core monitoring challenges where low or declining levels of violence do not necessarily indicate the absence of a criminal actors. And in fact, when speaking with civil society actors on the ground in Chiapas, they confirm that the Sinaloa cartel remain present. And instead, such decrease could potentially reflect informal arrangements, temporary pacts, or even a strategic restraint. But moving on from the example of Chiapas, and perhaps the last point on the impact of the Sinaloa factional war on conflict dynamics with rival criminal groups, So far, I have mostly made references to the Jalisco New Generation cartels, but we should also pay close attention to other local regional criminal groups that are likely to also exploit the Sinaloa cartel's fragmentation. So for instance, we have in Sonora, the Sonora Independent Cartel, which has prior to El Mayo's arrest, challenged the Sinaloa cartel and could continue efforts to push the Sinaloa cartel's expansion in these states. And likewise, we recorded incursions involving La Línea, which took its origin in the Juárez cartel in Chihuahua, especially in the municipality of Guadalupe y Calvo, where here we have observed spikes of violence in that particular municipality, which is likely a sign that this rival La Línea has been taking advantage of the relocations of Sinaloa cartel's affiliated cells to neighboring Sinaloa. Can we move on to the next slide, please? As part of this report, we have also taken a closer look at the Mexican government's evolving security response, and particularly during the first 6 months of Claudia Sheinbaum administration. What we have seen is a 33% increase in clashes between non-state armed groups and state forces. But I think here it's important to note that these spikes is largely driven by heightened operations in the state of Sinaloa, where the spikes in violence has been particularly striking. And this response actually began already in September 2024, right after the outbreak of the war. These operations have not only involved direct confrontations, but also intelligence-driven efforts. So we have seen, for instance, the destructions of drug-producing facilities, the seizures of drugs, including and the dismantling of surveillance systems, which actually you can see those specific asset destructions represented in green in the graph. Now, if we zoom out and look at the timeline, we see that these efforts continued after Sheinbaum took office, but intensified even further in early 2025. So here we can probably see the influence of external pressure from the United States, especially following the designations of major cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, and also the pressure exerted through the threats of trade tariff. And I think it's also no coincidence that many of these clashes have actually concentrated along the US border in states like Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. So here again, as part of this pressure to actually reduce drug and migrant flows coming from Mexico. But what we also see that these clashes and operations have been concentrating in long-standing hotspots like Michoacán and in Sinaloa, where the security responses has been most needed. Now, I think it's still very early to fully evaluate the impact of the new government strategies in reducing organized crimes. But the intensifications of operations have already sparked concern that these administrations might be leaning towards a revival of a kingpin strategy, which, as we've seen in the past, can fuel further fragmentations and violence, particularly in such a volatile landscapes. And I think if we take a closer look at Sinaloa, we have observed a slight decrease in gang-on-gang violence and civilian targeting in the first quarter of 2025 compared to the previous 3 months. Federal authorities have also reported a drop in homicides, but that doesn't tell the whole story. There's other forms of violence, for instance, forced disappearances that may actually be rising on the sides, and so are other criminal activities like extortions, and I'm sure Armando could tell a little bit more about that in a minute. But especially as rival factions are, scrambling to fund their ongoing conflict. So I think the case of Sinaloa and how violence might be evolving there is a clear example of how versatile and adaptive criminal groups can be under heightened pressure and should be taken into consideration when analyzing violence trends elsewhere. But I think, so overall, what we're looking at is a very fluid and volatile criminal landscapes where alliances shift, group fragments or merge. And I think it's important to underscore and keep in mind that the state is not just a responder, but also a key actor that can significantly shape conflict dynamics involving organized crime groups. So as attention remains focused on the major transnational organization, we also need to pay close attention to smaller local groups who could also be taking advantage of this moment to expand and assert control in areas that are newly vacated or contested. And I'll leave it here. I think I might have overspoken, and I'll hand it over to Armando, who I'm sure will provide very insightful additional information on the evolving conflict landscapes in Mexico. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to everyone here. First, I'd like to thank ACLED for the invitation, specifically Sandra and Maria. Congratulate them for the work they've done. It seems to me an extraordinary work. I'd like to highlight specifically two aspects of this work. First, in the academic field, and second, in the social level. From an academic perspective, this is extremely relevant. There's a major gap in the field of knowledge on the contemporary dynamics of organized crime in Mexico and in Latin America. This is very relevant to respond to that gap. It's educational, it's very well described. It provides both qualitative and quantitative evidence. It recurs not only to official documentation from the Mexican government, but also, as Sandra said, it makes use of narratives of the actors in the field as well. In the sense, it's a very robust piece of work. From a social perspective, the fact that it is a testimony to this historical moment that we are experiencing in our country tells us about the greatest reconfiguration of the criminal regime in Mexico in the 21st century. I'd like to delve into this notion of a criminal regime. The criminal regime in Mexico is simply those territories in which the criminal groups establish the rules of the game at a political, economic, and social level, going over the heads of the state, the rule of law. Today in Mexico, there are ever more territories that are governed by organized crime and fewer territories under the governance of the rule of law. We see this now in the number of victims of criminal political violence, functionaries of the state. In 2024, we saw the most violent year in the history of Mexico. And right now, we have an election which may allow organized crime to finalize its cycle of criminal impunity through the internal war going on in Sinaloa. This represents an extreme risk to public safety in Mexico. In Mexico, Evalua, which is a civil society organization, it's a space for thinking and research on public policy, working for advocacy in response to major national problems. One of our lines of work is the security program, for which I am responsible. One of our lines of work within that is an effort to understand the criminal regime, its level of dominion in Mexico, and how we can respond to this. In the round of questions, we can go into greater depth on some of the public policy alternatives to compensate the rule of law. But right now, I would like to highlight 3 points. Picking up this report, which ACLED is presenting today, and reacting a little bit to some of the comments of Maria Fernanda and Sandra. I'd like to highlight where we are, rather where we're coming from, what the origin of this war is, what's our situation right now, and where this is going. First, where this has come from. Under the administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the criminal organizations moved forward with great ease through the control of the territory, of society, and the economy in large parts of the country. This is largely through a militarized attempt to control public safety, focused on a conflict between the armed forces, the establishment of perimeter controls, but not through combating the rooted role of criminality in the society. It's just through an effort to prevent that did not address the structural causes of violence. For this reason, the criminal organizations intensified their role and their presence in all the territories, and at a local level, they dug in. The Mayos, this faction of the Sinaloa Cartel, became more empowered under the regime of López Obrador, especially in the absence of Joaquín Guzmán, El Chapo, and it became one of the principal organizations in the traffic of fentanyl. As my companions here have pointed out, the tension of the Mayos, without the participation of the Mexican state, which realized the weakness of the Mexican state and the secondary role that it is playing in international safety, this generated or developed into the internal conflict within the Sinaloa Cartel. The families that made up the Confederation of the Sinaloa Cartel got destructured. Joaquín Pardo, many people consider that the Sinaloa Cartel no longer exists as we knew it. And I'm going to talk about two different organizations that are completely different, the Mayos and the Chapos, beginning a conflict of unprecedented proportions in the 21st century in Mexico. This is a conflict which coexists and combines with already existing conflicts in the Mexican territory, not only between the Sinaloa Cartel, but also between this cartel and the Jalisco New Generation, the Cartel of the Northeast, and a whole spectrum of other regional and local cartels present in Mexico. In Mexico, there are some 100 and 500 criminal organizations, between national scale ones and regional, local, and micro local ones. We could look at them one entity at a time, but we don't have time to go into that. I hope there will be other spaces in which to do that. For now, I'll make a very brief summary of some of the regions that I think are key and which illustrate how the criminal map is moving and changing based on this conflict within what was formerly the Sinaloa Cartel. Let's start with the north. This is the area where the conflicts have intensified the most. These are areas that were already in dispute, but the violence has caught on. It's contagious to other regions of the north. And now we are seeing high levels of violence, as in the southern part of Baja California. Here, we're seeing a renewal of the criminal relationships between the Sinaloa Cartel and as well as the local administrations and authorities. This, in the case of Baja California in the south, we have seen that there are elements of Chapo Isidro, known as the Office. These collaborate with Los Mayos. We're seeing this also in places like Chihuahua and regions of Durango, which has a very particular situation. The violence is reaching there very heavily, but it's not exempt from these problematics. In the center of the country, we can see the presence of the Sinaloa Cartel and that its operations are working in alliance with other cartels. In Mexico City, we're seeing a very intense reconfiguration of the criminal map, which is being fed by this internal conflict. In Mexico City, we're also seeing unprecedented levels of homicide and violence, a very intense dispute between the Tepito Union and other micro-local actors, like the Train of Aragua, in which the Sinaloa Cartel is seeking to establish alliances to take advantage of these existing disputes. This is what these are areas which the official data show as high safety or high security, but they're not exempt from the reaccumulation of criminal activity and violence. In the case of Occidente Vacío, the third region that we're looking at of great relevance, in the Bajío, we can identify entities like Jalisco, the activity of Jalisco New Generation, as well as entities like Tayerit, which is a bastion of Jalisco Nueva Generación or New Generation. There are also the Zacatecas, which is one of the frequently disputed by the Sinaloa Cartel, and then in Guanajuato, which is one of the most violent areas in Mexico, due to the presence of the Sinaloa Cartel, the Jalisco New Generation, Santa Rosa, and others. I'm sorry, there was a technical problem in the office, but we had a brief blackout, but now I'm connected via telephone. So in the Bajío, we're seeing the presence of both actors from the Sinaloa Cartel, the Mayos, the Chapitos, but also actors like the New Generation of Jalisco and Santa Rosa. This is a very violent dispute for access to new illicit markets in which extortion is one of the main markets that is in dispute by organized crime networks. Another region that we're seeing a lot of conflict in is the southwest of Mexico, the region of Chiapas. Not only Chiapas, but also Tabasco and Quintana Roo. Right now, Tabasco is one of the regions with the greatest increase of homicidal violence. This can be explained in part by the internal conflict in which factions of the Sinaloa Cartel are trying to establish alliances with local cartels in order to exploit some of the territories which are, there's no longer one hegemonic domain by the Sinaloa Cartel, but rather the war going on in Culiacan demands that the Sinaloa Cartel takes its troops, leaving other areas not covered. And that is where organizations like Jalisco New Generation are taking advantage of that absence to dispute these new territories. The violence in Tabasco has increased vastly in just 1 year. Right now, the public attention is principally in Sinaloa and nearby areas like, but it's actually generated an increase in violence also in the center of the country and in the southeast. Right now, it's not only in Mexico City, it's also in Guerrero, Morelos. These are areas which previously were not present in the official discourse as areas of concern. Now we're seeing this violence spreading due to this internal war within the Sinaloa Cartel. This reconfiguration of the criminal regime and the criminal map goes together with a extreme increase in the violence present in our country. To close this talk, I'd like to highlight where we are now. And I think it's right there in the thick of this violence, caused in large part by this conflict. in addition to the data, which the data generated by the Mexican government are not valid or reliable. There's a broad margin for the manipulation of data. There's a broad margin for creating unreliable data due to tremendous debilities in the public safety and security services in Mexico. All we need is a body in order to in order to establish the datum of homicide, but at present Mexico does not have the resources to do this work. So this is important to highlight. The data are not reliable for monitoring or reporting the rate of homicide in the country. They're even less valid to report or follow the work of these criminal organizations, which have advanced in their techniques for extermination. Right now, without a doubt, the best index is the rate of disappeared and not recovered people in Mexico. This has increased enormously. If we include femicides and people that have been disappeared and not recovered, the panorama of violence in Mexico is really, truly alarming. It represents a crisis of insecurity that corresponds to this violent reconfiguration of the criminal regime in our country. I invite you to consult Pacification and Violence, which is a monthly report that Mexico Evalua publishes. This allows us to observe the changes in homicidal violence in Mexico and an effort to understand how these criminal organizations are reconfiguring themselves. At present, as a consequence of this, we are seeing a reconfiguration of the criminal map based on this implosion of the Sinaloa Cartel, in which other organizations are taking advantage to impose their hegemony and make space for themselves. So despite and against the official discourse in Mexico, we are seeing a wave of homicidal violence, which, as Sandra has said, has been accompanied by other crimes like extortion. This is a source of funding for the war, as well as other non-traditional markets like human trafficking in the border areas, both in the northern and the southern border. They have told us that these activities are even more profitable than drug trafficking. I'm ready to hear any questions that may have arisen.
Many thanks to all three of you for those really insightful interventions. I'm very pleased and sad at the same time to say that we have a number of questions, which is great, but we won't be able to get to them live. We do promise that we'll get back in writing to those that we don't have time to cover. And if you haven't already typed your questions, please do so either in English or Spanish. So we'll start with a question perhaps for Maria Fernanda, which is something that both the report alludes to and Armando touched on in his intervention, and is something that actually a lot of observers of organized crime are pondering, which is whether actually such a thing as the Sinaloa Cartel still exists. I mean, the group has historically had a federal structure. Disputes between groups under the umbrella of the cartel are not new, but this is quite an unprecedented all-out war. I mean, do you envision the cartel reconfiguring? Are we indeed moving to a scenario where smaller groups operate entirely for themselves? Is this the end, effectively, of the cartel?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. So it's really early also to know how the structure will look in the aftermath, but definitely there will be a transformation in the alliances. And even if it's the debate is constant about the existence or not, or if the Sinaloa continues to be what it was at the beginning, it certainly works as a complex network of criminal organizations that created mechanisms to coexist. And we see that in what is happening right now in Sinaloa, and how when those mechanisms were used, levels of violence were low. And when there is a situation that undermines the mechanism, the network is forced to reorganize itself. And I think it will depend on how it evolves, but the alliances here and how they are shifting, it would be crucial to see how the federation, if the federation survives with, as it happened maybe in the past with when the breakup between the Beltran Labor Organization and the Sinaloa Cartel in 2008, and see if maybe there is the faction that reduces its operations while the other criminal network continues to dominate the area that still has, or if something different happened. But right now what we are seeing is that at least the strategy is that Los Mayos are looking at their allies, in the regional allies in that have traditional been working with them. We have the Cabrera Sarabia family, the recent alliance with El Chapo Isidro, and Los Chapitos also are looking to form new alliances, but looking more outside. And we have the suspected alliance with the Jalisco Cartel, that we are not seeing nothing concrete yet in terms of actions, but these all are factors that will be important to see how the restructure of the Sinaloa Cartel will end in the end of this war. Sorry.
Many thanks, Maria Fernanda. I also want to throw another question at Armando, if you don't mind, just in line of the intervention and the work that Mexico Evalua does. So the report notes quite drastic changes in the stance of state security forces, leaving behind hugs, not bullets policy, moving towards a stance that perhaps is more similar to past kingpin policies. I mean, there are risks to the security policy that is entirely reliant on prevention, and also Mexico and Latin America at large have experienced the drawbacks of both iron fist approaches and even the so-called kingpin strategy. Mexico Evalua has worked a lot on formulating very clear public policy recommendations on security, and in light of the complex context right now of insecurity in Mexico, how should the federal government respond? What are some of the key lines of action that Mexico Evalua has delineated?
First, without a doubt, hugs, not bullets, has come to its end. We published a evaluation of the security policies of López Obrador, in which we saw that his policies were completely irrelevant. They had no effect in terms of reducing the criminal violence. The hypothesis is more valid if we understand criminal violence as and its changeability as a response to the relations between different criminal organizations. Under the administration of Claudia Sheinbaum, we see a reconfiguration of we have seen a brutal increase in the arrest of organized crime heads, the arrest and intervention of shipments of drugs, of fentanyl, and the direct confrontations between the armed forces and criminal groups. This kind of policy, I think, responds to two different motives. On the one hand, the hopes of Scheinbaum herself to validate herself in Mexico. This is the only area in which she is proving able to create her own legacy. This also responds to the tariff pressures of Donald Trump, who has taken insecurity as a pretext to impose his own economic expansionist policies. However, this increase in arrests and intervention of drugs, of weapons, etc., have not translated into a reduction of the criminal violence, as we have seen in the report. It seems to me that right now, President Scheinbaum is more concerned about getting good results than she's thinking about her own political career more than in the building of a real situation of safety in Mexico. So what are some of the measures that we consider relevant? We need public policies that address different aspects of organized crime beyond homicide in order to balance out the state's intervention. There's one on attention to homicidal violence that might lead to the underprotection of other regions. Right now, there's a lot of attention to unconventional illicit markets, which is leaving other regions underprotected, given the reconfiguration of the map of violent crime. In order to limit the range of the conflict, we need the increase of local security organizations encapsulating relevant organizations that at present are not participating in these conflicts. It's very important that other organizations with important social weight. The Mexican state does not have the capacity to confront multiple conflicts, such as we're seeing in Sinaloa at the same time. So it's very important that other organizations, like, for example, the Cartel of Santa Rosa Lima, that they do not try to leave Guanajuato. To provide a terrifying data item about some 80% of municipal police in Mexico don't have access to the Social Security. So we have 4,000 police officers that simply are not receiving a salary. So that creates incredible opportunities for the construction of a criminal regime. It's very important to establish public policies against criminal political policy. We have to stop the attack against candidates and public functionaries, because through this kind of violence, the criminal groups co-opt governments and try to impose themselves within the reconfiguration of the criminal map. We're coming out of the most violent criminal period in the history of our country. The response by the security forces has failed, and we need other criteria for how to focus this, how to orient this. One of the criteria has been the data on crime frequency, but we do need to focus rather on non-conventional illicit markets. We need to focus on encapsulating violent criminal organizations in order to not let fly further violence.
Many thanks, Armando. I just want to ask a very, very quick question to wrap up in just about a minute. Sandra, sorry to put you under pressure of the clock, but we've mentioned a few times something that is quite close to ACLED's heart in terms of a priority for analysis, which is precisely what Armando was talking about, is violence targeting local officials, which ACLED tracks and analyzes quite regularly. Very, very briefly, what would be some of the key highlights of the trends that you're seeing in that particular form of violence in Mexico in terms of, in the context of this rift and more broadly?
Yeah, thank you. Really briefly, When it comes to violence targeting political figures, the past research have revealed that there's multiple drivers of violence behind the targeting of these specific groups. So it can be linked to political disputes among contesting power brokers, and it can also be linked to organized crime groups. So as such, we will see a rise of this violence in the context of elections. So we have a couple of local elections this year. We have seen, for instance, an increase of violence targeting candidates, political figures in Veracruz, which are due to vote, which local campaigns have just begun. But I think what is also important to highlight is that these forms of violence continue outside of the electoral cycle. And what we have seen in the case of Sinaloa is a perfect example of that, of how increased competitions between criminal groups have repercussions on the political spheres, either through armed groups trying to penetrate institutions and using violence to coerce local officials and gain that kind of access. So that's something we're seeing in Sinaloa. But as Armando mentioned, there is other focus of potential rise of conflict. We have Tabasco, we have different areas. And I think it's very important to continue monitoring what's happening at the level of violence targeting officials, because it is an indicator of ongoing political competition and penetrations of organized crime groups. And I think it's something that we should especially bear in mind in the context of the judicial elections that are due to happen this year. How are organized crimes going to leverage these new forms of elections to further penetrate state institutions? And sorry, that's all I can say in 2 minutes.
Many thanks, Sandra. And thank you to all three of you for the brilliant insights and the analysis, both in the report and some of the implications of it. Special thanks to Armando for joining us today and lending his expertise and his organization's really insightful work. And thank you to all of you who've joined us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, and we do have a number of questions unanswered, but we'll do our best to get back to people on those. Let me wrap up by encouraging you, if you haven't already, to read the full report, which you can find, of course, on ACLED's website, but also in the link that's been provided in the chat. And I really, really hope that you found this discussion fruitful, and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in many future ACLED webinars. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely evening or morning, depending on where you are.